drought, something's going to happen, you know. So let's design a landscape that can change and accommodate it, and I think should change over time. It's a very flexible, forgiving. Actually, I really want to write a whole book about this idea that you don't have to get it right the first time. In fact, Mother Nature will guarantee that you don't. So with that in mind, we're going to work that in a little bit. But, you know, planting this monoculture, like Greg was talking about, is just tempting fate. Yes, you may choose what at the time is the very best plant for screening. As you know, UT used to push Leland cypress as the best things that sliced bread, fast growing, tall, dense. But guess what? Diseases adapt sometimes to availability. You know, we know that we kind of think about it in a way like, you know, some of our diseases that adapt to overcome bacteria. They can develop these pests and these insects and these diseases can develop different gene codes that help them overcome resistance to disease, because the ones that have done the best job killing plants are the ones that survive and are the spores that float around and infect new plants. So we overplanted them and we created opportunity for these diseases to evolve until finally Ceridium canker has become a terrible disease on our Leland cypress, and it's on our do not plant list, which, by the way, our new pub, I will mention it during the talk. I have a slide on there. I'm not going to try to link us up to it online because I tend to screw up when I do that. But if you will take a picture of that slide, or we'll send it to you by email, then go to uthort.com and you'll find our spring planting design and tips. We'll look at that a little bit more later. So we don't want to do this. This is just saying that you're clairvoyant. You know that on out into the future, there is not going to be a new disease or a new pest that's been introduced that's going to spread rampantly through here. We know a whole bunch of things are like headed this way. We know what happened to the American elm. We know what happened to the American chestnut. So we've got to be sure we diversify. And diversification is our best bet for having a flexible, forgiving design. Landscape design is all about not only accommodating change, knowing it will happen, but you know, as your inspiration changes, we change our house around. So don't worry about getting it. Because here's what Lelands do. You'll see, typically if you have Lelands, you'll see a limb die. Just the whole limb will become brown. And that's very, very typical of this canker. This canker is a fungal disease that once it lands on the bark and begins to spread, it clogs up the vascular system of that tree. And the first vascular system it's going to clog up is of that branch where it began. By the time you've seen it, it's in your trunk. And there is nothing that you can do to save the tree. If you see just one little one starting and you get it out of there, you may be able to preserve some of your other Lelands, but I just don't recommend them anymore. I say hedge your bets. If you've got Lelands right now and they're still good, I would go ahead and start planting a meandering row of something else that looks good with them as a backdrop to be sure that you can keep that good Leland planting. And stressed Lelands are especially prone. If they get drought stressed or damaged or otherwise have some issues, that sets them up for Ceridium canker. All right, so if you, I don't want you to do a row, I'm sorry, that side, we're looking at this. Let's say we get lucky and they all do well, but one gets taken out. Then what are you going to have? You're going to have the missing tooth, right? You're setting yourself up, even if you do the best planning possible, and one gets knocked out by lightning or the cows or whatever. So we don't want to set ourselves up for this kind of disaster. We want to think about a painting that if you took one little part out, it's not really going to be missing the total composition. And besides this, boring. I mean, a line of things just marching across the landscape. I do like some formality in the landscape, but I'm usually going to do that structurally. I'm going to repeat something or certain elements. So we're going to look at that. But if anything looks the same, you know, to me, that's like Andy Warhol soup cans. It's not something I want to look at for a long time. I don't want to look at that Jackson Pollock either. It's just a big old mess. And there's nothing in there that my eye is happy finding and recognizing. So, and I like to compare it to music. I did this last time too. We don't want a monotonous, repetitive nursery rhyme for a screen. And we don't want a crazy bunch of jazz notes either, where we can't remember what the music is supposed to sound like. We want a structural repetition here and there that then we can improvise on. And that's going to keep it interesting and forgiving. Like this, you know, this would be very problematic because, yeah, you could replace the firepower in Andina anytime, but who even knows what kind of boxwood that is? People don't realize there are different species of boxwood, different cultivars of boxwood. So let's don't set ourselves up for failure. Now, let's mention these repeating elements because I think a lot of times people can use sort of what's there. They want to rip out, you know, a natural looking woodland because it looks a little bit weedy and replace it with something more uniform and cleaned up. Well, first of all, I'm going to preach against that just a little bit because then their next question is what happened to all the wildlife, right? So we should probably think about instead, let's keep what's there that's worthy. We may edit it a little bit or we may add to it. So I know just recently a lady sent me a picture of a slope down her driveway and they had cleaned out all the underbrush under the woodland and they wanted to formally landscape there in front of it. And I said, why don't you just let it be and sort of repeat some elements there in front of it? And it doesn't have to be identical, but it looks very intentional. So you can see how these repeating forms, right? We got that wonderful slender pyramidal evergreen that's going to be there and it implies some formality, some planting, and it pleases our eye. So this, you think about paintings, that's one of the things that pleases our eye. So here's a screen, right? We got some repeating forms there in the background, our taller things in the background. We got some repeating forms with the grasses. So we've got, but then we got a lot of, you know, flexibility and improvisation. So if something in there dies, we are not ruined. And we've got interesting contrast with form and foliage and shapes and textures. So that is a fabulous thing to look at year round. And if something dies or we want to add something, we can do all that. Here's one up at Jimmy Williams, Jimmy's house. This is looking out up at the street, actually, that runs in front of his house. And he put, you know, just some tall growing evergreens back there. And then he used that as a backdrop for all this informal material. But you still see some repeating elements, right? You see the pyramidal of just our Eastern red cedar. Those are just plants. Jimmy's cheap. He doesn't mind me saying that he dug up and transplanted there. And then that was just the backdrop for his beautiful seasonal material. And he makes a few shrubs deliberately geometrical. He likes to do a little bit of shearing and shaping, really just to keep them where he can plant a little bit more stuff between them because he's such a plant geek. But we see the repeating forms there. We see all this fabulous color and seasonal interest. Here at, this is Liz Manjone's house in Memphis. She planted mostly holly Neal, Mary Neal hollies there in the background. There's a lot of good large hollies, but then she informalized it, you know, with some deciduous material so that we don't look like we're looking at a screen. There's a house just right behind there. And that dark green, by the way, see how she put the variegated plants against them to make them really show. Those variegated plants wouldn't be nearly as handsome if they were against a bright sky. You would notice them as well. And there's one, that is one of my very favorite plants. And even here with the Mary Neal hollies, which are these wonderful big pyramids, and it's also a great illustration that tells people not to use them as foundation plantings. Put them out there as perimeters and let them be, and this is what will occur. But see, she also mixed in some other materials, some southern wax myrtle and some deciduous material. And again, the backdrop with those variegated sedges and some of her shade-loving plants. So it's a great way to go. Just think about that too, as we're composing these evergreen screens and these mixed screens, that it's a great opportunity for using, you know, burgundy foliage against bright foliage and some flowering plants in front of that. And this is going to lead us to talking about the way the lists are constructed. And let me get to that here. Oh, this is just one more thing about design before we get to the list advice. When you're designing those screens, and I know sometimes it's hard to think about landscape design. People walk out, and I would rather do it on site. They get a little confused. I like to think about my floor, and my floor is turf grass at my house because I have dogs, and it's the thoroughfare around which I move. I don't try to maintain it to golf course standards, so it's extremely low maintenance zoysia that I barely have to mow during the hotter parts of summer. Think of that turf grass or whatever your flooring is, if it's a patio or paving or even mulch, as water. So think about a pool of water, and I let the beds take shape around that pool. So it's got a very naturalistic look to it. And that flat plane pleases my eye, because if the whole picture were crammed full of plants, it would look messy and disorganized. So think about it as a pool if you want to do an entire perimeter, or you can create a line if you want to with just a perimeter. We've got, you know, nice edging here and turf, different seasonal good perennials going on different times of the year. And even if it's not a big area, you can use a mix of plants. I mean, that's an interesting little composition that's all about just shapes and forms. And that could be used even in the smaller yard so that you're not looking at that row of boring shrubbery. So the backdrop here at Jimmy's, we see we got a great evergreen backdrop, deciduous material. And remember layering, because layering is what naturally occurs in nature. And that picture, you can realize, is fantastic wildlife habitat, because we've got different heights. You know, not all birds like treetops. There are certainly many that do. A lot of our summer residents that have just arrived, I love hearing them as they come in late spring. The summer tanager has just arrived at my house. Some of the warblers, yellow-billed cuckoo are one of the last that's going to arrive. I don't have whippoorwills yet, but I'm expecting them any minute now. But they like, a lot of those will like those, not whippoorwill, but those warblers and those tanagers, those cuckoos like that upper canopy. But a whole lot of other birds prefer the smaller trees and shrubs. That's where they're going to nest. Some of them will nest low to the ground on the shrubs, or even on the ground under the shrubs. And then what we've done here really is imitate nature, right? Because in nature, that's what you find, these levels of canopy, and all that foliage is allowed to go down to the ground and rot and decompose and restore nutrients to the plants that are growing there, which is a much healthier and more natural condition than us trying to make those plants compete with turf grass and then having to provide nutrients for them. Decomposing matter, you can create an area like this. It's going to be lower maintenance than trying to do all that thing. And while you're doing that, consider, like, as I mentioned, leaving what's there. If it's beautiful, you know, you might want to think about, I really like the backdrop, but I might want to create a little bit more of a disciplined border. I mean, I might not want to walk out all the way up to this wood's edge. This is at my house, because I feel like I'm going to get chiggers, or I've just pulled another tick off of me this morning. I don't know, I've had about already 9 or 10 tick bites this season. And right now they're the little bitty seed ticks that you don't notice until they're embedded. And this one was in a very, very, very personal place and was very difficult to actually extract. So I maybe just want to landscape along that border and apply some discipline to it. And sometimes all that takes is a good, nicely mowed line, you know, right up to it. And let it be a good mix of evergreens and deciduous. This is what was already there. So evaluate what's already there before you start ripping stuff out. And that's going to mean we got plants for pollinators. We got plants. Leave some of that deciduous material that exists. Because when we talk about butterfly gardens, you know, everybody likes to think about flowering plants and flowering plants and flowering plants. And that's true. But a lot of our native trees are host plants, and not even our native. Some of our ornamental plants that we, you know, are from Asia will host a lot of our native insects if they're closely related. So put in those deciduous materials, let that be a canopy layer, and you're going to actually be providing for butterflies. It's not just about having the flowering plants, although that's always fabulous. Add some. This is Joe Pye weed right out on the road at my house down in a low ditch. And the hummingbirds, of course, they're here. I've had feeders out. Now they're really starting to get busy there, and they're going to be building nests. And hummingbirds usually nest. If you want to ever find one, look up David Pitt's ornithologist, and he tracks them to their nest, and he finds them usually on a specific side of a specific height of certain types of trees. And it's really kind of cool information. I just want to brag on y'all, because I know that as gardeners, you care about birds, and I was astounded to find these figures that this is what we spend on feeding our wild birds and caring for our wild birds. And what benefit, you know, I mean, obviously we get some benefit from contributing to the wildlife environment, the ecological benefits of what we eat and what we breathe, because air just might be a little bit important. But I'm always kind of astounded at how big-hearted people are. And this is across all political realms, right? People who love the wildlife and provide for it. And it kind of makes my heart happy to think about how many people right now are buying sugar for the little hummingbirds right now as we stand across America. Think about all the grocery stores where people got sugar, and it just makes me so happy. So let's think about our boundaries then, our screens, as opportunities to do this too. Because if we do that in monoculture, I'm not saying it's going to provide no benefit, because birds require shelter. So any march of a straight monoculture of evergreens is going to provide some shelter, and it's going to help anchor soil. And it may even, you'd be surprised how many critters do actually eat on our evergreens as well, because there are many that they will. Sometimes some of the more obscure species, but we shouldn't discriminate against them. We need insects, as E.O. Wilson calls them, the little critters that run the world. So let's include that in our thinking. When we buy these plants to create our boundaries, we're going to include those. It's going to make us happier. This is a great pub. If you haven't discovered this one yet, Natalie and Craig Harper and I collaborated on this. It seems like there was somebody else in on that. So if you will go to that pub, the first half about it is about attracting wildlife and all the things you need to do, and a lot of the plants that are going to be helpful for you. And the second half, because sometimes that can be an issue, if you have wildlife that's damaging your house or your structures or your garden. And there's a whole lot of mythology out there online about how you control things. So let's remember, we are research-based information. And I just had to help somebody out the other day at a garden center who was buying some kind of snake repellent or something, that's just bogus information. So go there and you'll learn a lot about the layering effects, the good plants, and other things you need to attract wildlife, as well as how to control some that sometimes get pestiferous. Now, let's go back to thinking about screens for just a minute. A lot of times when I'm talking about these perimeter screens, it may take a while for them to get developed, although I'm going to recommend a crowded tapestry screen that has a little bit of a meandering habit, where you're going to plant and use loose random W's and stuff where you have some overlap, and you'll get screening faster. A lot of people will go out there and they say, oh, these plants are going to be 10 feet wide eventually. I'm going to plant them at 10-foot spacing, and they march along, and every 10 feet they put down a stake, and that's where they plant it. And then they stare at the gaps for years and years and the mulch between them. When I'm all about, no, let's drop back and put something behind them a little bit and something in front of them a little bit. We're going to create, like, two things like this are going to take forever, but if they're like that, so put one big, if you're in a hurry to sit somewhere and you don't want to see that neighbor, or you need that privacy from looking at the school bus, one big evergreen, invest in it and block your view right here close up, right? You can take it out later. Once the screen, I call those temporary plants. We're going to create us a temporary situation that's going to give us what we want quickly. And then later, when the screen has gotten to that place where we want it, we can take that out and enjoy looking at it with all the seasonal color and the wildlife and the fabulous perimeter things that are going to be going on. So here's one I kind of like to think about this idea too when we're screening. This is a place in Memphis on a busy street. And I always preach screening from inside the house or on your patio. You're looking out and you're creating a perimeter. And that is sort of like neglecting the view from the street. Like, I don't really care. I should care what people are seeing when they're driving down the street. Of course, I live out in the country where I don't really want anybody to know I'm back there anyway. But if I were in town, I kind of always think about it selfishly from what am I seeing? But these people did both. And this is what's so clever, because again, I'm not smart. I'm just barely smart enough to recognize a good idea and go, bingo, because this is from the street. And yet on the other side, where you're going to find that house, they have used this as their screen to look at from the house. So all they did was back it up. They had enough room on that property, and not all of us do, to make it attractive with a little bit of lawn. And why is that important? If you live in town and you have easements, right? If they ever want to, they can come rob you of that property or dig up your lines, your sewer lines, your water lines. You don't own that. They do. They can do whatever they want. That would ruin your screen, wouldn't it? So think about that as well. Don't put those screens where somebody else can take it over and public domain kind of thing. But this was very, very clever. Plus, I love the use of using both plant materials of different textures and forms and shapes and some solid structural material. We talk about that repetitive element, right? Doesn't that provide for you what might just look completely like a wild woodland? But to me, the repeating forms of the rocks and the little bit of gray fence there that's formal, geometric, it says, I'm a straight line right here, makes us feel like the hand of man has intentionally created this. Yet how forgiven would we be? And something in there died. So great solution. We have a little bit of just an example here at the station. At one point, that right behind there was the Master Gardener composting bin area. And now it is actually Jason's little area where they dump mulch and media that he's going to be using on the grounds. And he's got a little concrete pad back there. So we don't really see that. This is a kind of a backdrop for our big display gardens out there. And we deliberately made a tapestry hedge. So you see in there, we've got some of the Elaeagnus abingii. Some Elaeagnus are illegal here in the state of Tennessee, so be aware of that. Abingii is not. And some Elaeagnus are terrible thugs, and rightfully so. See the magnolia in there, little gem magnolia? We've got a cherry laurel behind that, which I no longer recommend. I'll talk about that because it's gotten to be so susceptible to peachtree borer. Arizona cypress, eastern red cedar, a big holly, our anise tree. We got a little bit of grass in the foreground. So we show people this is how we call it a tapestry hedge. Now, if I'm doing this on a bigger scale, I'm probably going to put, 3 of those and 1 of these and 2 back there. And I'm going to make it more groupings so it has a little bit more impact. But, this looks very naturalistic and very forgiving. And before I get into the plants that I am going to recommend, I'm going to talk about the ones I really want you to avoid in the future because I know that Greg and I are going to get calls about them. They're often on sale right now because a lot of the growers are trying to get rid of them at a good price because they are no longer recommended. But our lelands can definitely be trouble. And if you have some that are still doing well, good luck. Keep them watered during droughty times and take care of them. But I would start hedging my bets by replanting. The red tip photinia was, the real biggie when I was coming up. And it is spectacular. I have to admit, I was admiring some that have still survived the Entomosporium leaf spot because the Entomosporium leaf spot has killed tons of them, especially over here in West Tennessee where it is so humid. Entomosporium also affects the Indian hawthorn, if you know that plant. So you get a little spot like that, and eventually it defoliates the tree, and over a period of years it will kill that tree. Now, can you prevent it? Yes. You have to start spraying right at bud break, and you have to keep spraying for several weeks during the summer while it has the new growth on it. And I'm like, I just don't want to. I don't have time. They get too big to spray. So again, I'm going to tell you to, just go ahead and get rid of those and start putting in some meandering replacements just in case. I will tell you that they have been breeding now for resistance. This is a hybrid between Chinese photinia and Japanese photinia. And there was more than one selection of those hybrids. And some of those have been resistant. So now they're starting to select some of those and they're starting to rebreed the Chinese photinia into the bloodline. I think crackling red is one of them that's out there that's supposed to be resistant. I'm kind of long. I was reading up on that actually just this morning before I did this program to see if there was an update because I'd heard there were new cultivars out there that were resistant. Well, Mike Durr, of course, who is our guru, the Manual of Woody Landscape Plants, woody plant expert, he says the jury's still out, and I agree because, I'm always a little dubious until I have seen things proven in the landscape for a great many years. So, but look for some of those resistant ones, or just get your straight old Chinese photinia. It doesn't have that bright red growth, but if you have a good one, good for you. Cherry laurels were one I recommended a lot because they would be shade tolerant as well. The only thing they really required was good drainage. And then a whole lot of new plantings began to decline. I saw them all over West Tennessee for the last several years. And upon close examination, we found that they have become now a common victim of the peachtree borer, which we should have anticipated because there isn't any prunus that can't fall victim, as far as I know, to peachtree borer. Some seem to resist a little better or a little bit longer. And peachtree borer is one of those difficult borers to control. There are some we can put a systemic on and it will control, like the one that's attacking red maples now so much. if you want to protect your young planted red maples. A lot of people don't want to use those. They are the neonicotinoids. And other times I just would rather choose something that I didn't have to worry about. So the cherry laurels, I'm just telling people, you know, I think their day is done, or don't rely on them too heavily. Another thing I'm going to warn you about is a lot of times around here you can see a lot of old country homes where they planted fast-growing loblolly pines that'll grow in wet or dry soil, because that's what loblolly means. It means they'll grow even in a loblolly, which is a mud puddle. And they do grow fast. In fact, pretty soon they're just a trunk with a top knot of foliage up top, and they're not a screen anymore. And boy, are they prone to damage. They seem to just suck snow and ice out of the air and are going to break, fall on your house, or your power lines. They get a host of diseases and insects, you know, the bark beetles. They get rust diseases that will actually can girdle and kill. So I'm not going to ever recommend those. There are some pines I will recommend. And here we go. Now we're going to start kind of launch into the actual plants. Green Giant came along several years ago as the replacement for Lelands. So what happened? Suddenly people decided, oh, okay, I'm ripping out all my Lelands that are dying. I'm going to replace them with a line of Green Giants. Like, no, because now we're seeing problems with Green Giants. So let's be sure. I still would probably put a few Green Giants in there because they're fast. And maybe the other slower plants would have time to catch up before they actually begin to have some problems. But, you know, again, it's very, very, very. And look at this backdrop here. I'm just a little bit more about design of the major, mostly hollies, and backdrop of seasonal material. Oh, a few vertical plants. I'm talking about some of the things that we're going to find now in the, I thought I had a slide. I may have misplaced these, y'all. I'm sorry. I was rearranging slides all morning about trying to get them in a different order from an old screen planting talk that I did for the landscape people. And we're more picky. They want about 3 plants, and that's about it. But put some tall vertical in plants. One of our lists is about tall vertical plants. And I want to mention to you that, yeah, they're great for narrow spaces, but I think that's very limiting thought. Let's think about how much drama they create, because we talk about repeating forms, creating a little bit of formality. I mean, that would not be nearly as cool a composition without those repeating forms right there. Let me go on and see if I can get to where the slide composition. Nice looking compositions, right? Let me get to, I promise I'm gonna get pretty soon here to where I introduced the talk. Well, maybe I didn't. Greg, I may have forgotten to put in that slide. I don't know. I composed a slide that had a link to the publication. But it's uthort.com, Screen Plantings for Tennessee. These are just still slide demonstrating different types of textures and plants using your turf grass like a highway through there. And before I get to just plant, let me talk about small places and using some structure as part of your quick screen, right? Sometimes that's what's necessary. Sometimes we don't have room for a big meandering perimeter of plants. And some of the structural elements, instead of just a flat, you know, fence in the face that just says, you know, no go here, which is, to me, it's bad feng shui, which, you know, we want to feel like there's places to go. We want to feel like there's destination, and we want air. Look at these beautiful windows we've sort of created here, this structure. We got a cozy place to invite people over. So sometimes structure is the remedy, especially if you want to go low maintenance and you've got a small lot somewhere in town. Let's look at structural options that may not be all that expensive when you start thinking about all the plants and upkeep, right? That's going to be minimal upkeep right there. And again, this is more of a trellis, a courtyard garden, has no grass. We are just creating a barrier between the house and the house next door, and some raised bed garden for us as we get older, where we can sit and care for those plants. Using structural elements maybe to incorporate with part of our screen. This is a weeping blue Atlas cedar, completely hardy for us and good for us all across Tennessee, even in the hot, humid parts, over a structure to act like a weeping waterfall of evergreen foliage. And I'm still talking design. While we're planting, remember I lectured you on don't do exact 10-foot spacings and then have to look at polka dots on the landscape. This is a slide I took many years ago over in your part of the country. Some of you may recognize, I don't remember where I was on the Cumberland Plateau, but I was driving around on little back roads looking for the beautiful clusters I admire of eastern red cedar through the winter months, the repeating forms, that dark blackish green. I know a lot of people love to hate our Juniperus virginiana. It's actually a juniper, but I don't. I think it's a spectacular plant, and we wouldn't be Tennessee without it. Look at how I showed this to my mother years before she died, and she said, "Oh, I know what you like about that." And I said, "What's that?" She said, "You like the way the birds planted those clusters." And I said, "Exactly." We use that a lot of times when we are planting daffodils, right? We want a naturalistic looking group. We throw out there and we plant where every rock has hit the ground is where we put a daffodil. So it is really random and not too intentional. And I think we should do that with our screen plantings as well, again, so it doesn't mess up. It's more interesting than that row. On these structures, I'm going to mention a few plants that will work as vines. And I'm going to mention Clematis armandii, although I'm worried about it on the plateau. I've seen some splendid armandiis even in Oak Ridge and in Knoxville. It's an evergreen clematis. See that big glossy evergreen foliage? It is a spring bloomer, and that is one reason to enjoy it. But the main reason it's grown is for that fabulous evergreen foliage. Even in Oak Ridge, my friend Faye Beck has had this for years there, where they've had extremely cold winters in years past, and it got killed back to the ground. It did come back. So it still might be worth a gamble in those most protected spots in your garden. Here you see it as a backdrop on this fence. And what an attractive fence. If we use fence, let's try to make it attractive and fun. Spend a little bit more. If you're going to have to be looking at a fence a lot, use a nice color that isn't going to be too white glares and it jumps out at you and it shows every speck of dirt. You know, if an insect dies on it, if a bird poops on it, you're going to see it. So choose, to me, grays and light wheats, you know, browns. So my soil is sort of reddish, so I kind of go with wheats and tans and some grays. Weathered barn colors always appeal to me. Here you see Clematis armandii in Nashville, and isn't that an attractive fence? These people only had a tiny little front yard, and they wanted to enjoy it as personal landscape space. So they did, and I like the industrial look, this fabulous rusted metal fence, and then softened it with some plant material. And the Clematis armandii is doing that for them here in this setting, right down the street from my friend Leanne Barron in Nashville. Carolina jessamine, sometimes I just, you know, warn people about this plant, even though it's sold a lot in garden centers as a great native, because it's not completely hardy this far north. It's a plant that I find to be completely hardy as you go south. But even here in West Tennessee, when we have a hard winter, it can get killed back. Mine has decided it's coming back from the ground this year after that cold snap that we had. It is native, it is evergreen, and it is quite vigorous. And I'm going to tell you not to use it, but maybe find that protected spot and be aware that it could be killed if we have, you know, single digits for any extended period, or especially below digits. You know, everybody says, you didn't tell people that the blooms were poisonous. Yeah, the blooms are poisonous. Don't go sucking on them like you would a honeysuckle or something. There's a whole lot of poisonous plants out there in your yard that people don't go sucking on or chewing up or eating. Yews are poisonous. Azaleas are poisonous. They say that bees may make nectar from this that is poisonous, but I haven't seen that really proven anywhere. So there, I said it. But I'm not going to tell you not to plant it because the blooms are poisonous. I think a lot of times this toxic plant thing gets blown. A lot of times you have to eat a whole truckload of plants to get poisoned. And here's the vine I am going to tell you to plant. And it has become highly popular and widely used in the landscape for good reason. And it is a reblooming form of our native honeysuckle. Years ago, I recommended, before Major Wheeler was available, which is reblooming form of native honeysuckle, I just recommended our coral honeysuckle, sometimes called trumpet honeysuckle, for an all-native planting up here at a state park in the Paris area, Paris Landing. And I'll be darned if the know-it-all ranger came along and ripped them all out because I had planted a honeysuckle. And I thought, really, you don't know the difference in that we do have a native honeysuckle? So sometimes people who get all about against a particular plant have not really even done their research. So remember, this is native. Now, Major Wheeler came out. The first reblooming form I had was fantastic, and it was named Alabama Crimson. I'm sorry about the name. I didn't name it, but it was Alabama Crimson. And I have to order that online now, and I'm going to because I want to compare it to Major Wheeler because Major Wheeler is hard to beat. This is at my house. This is Major Wheeler. Now I have 2 or 3 on the other side of the house on some old fencing. And if you don't have a place for this, just put up a little piece of fence. I mean, this sounds crazy. It was just for structure, but it's not crazy if you love your hummingbirds and you want a great backdrop. Go put 3 posts in the ground. Go to the co-op or the feed store and buy a fence panel and put it on those posts. And there you've got a vine backdrop where you can put this blooms from like March to November. Tries to bloom out a little bit during the warm parts of winter. It's gotten tough to find this year, but everything's gotten tough to find this year because COVID has been such a boom in the gardening industry that the growers cannot grow them fast enough to supply as much as is needed at the garden centers. I have people calling me from garden centers, kidding, I can't find this plant. I've always been able to find it. And I'll have to suggest often some of the replacement plants that I think I wanted them to use anyway, instead of that more common one. But I did hunt around here. I have found it locally up at 3-Way, and I bought some from my niece who's redoing her landscape down in Mississippi to take to her next weekend. And we will have it in our plant sale, by the way. There's 36 of them. I just checked with Jason. They're going to be small, but it'll grow vigorously and fast. And this is going to be full of hummingbirds. I mean, the hummingbirds, if you love your hummingbirds, you got to have a Major Wheeler honeysuckle. Another great native that's blooming right about now. This is another native called crossvine, which kind of seems like you should plant it in Crossville, right? The Crossville crossvine. It's usually in the treetops when we're walking around. If you go out in the woods this time of year, you'll probably see it first on the ground. You'll see some orange blossoms underfoot, usually timed with, some of the invasive wisteria. So let's go back and replace it with this guy. And you'll look up and you'll see it up there in the treetops. And if you bring it out and give it more sunlight, you're going to get a wall of bloom. They're more sparingly blooming out there in that shade. They're always trying to reach more sunlight. They'll take wet or dry soils, and they're just fabulous. Our native form has got a red outside and a yellow throat. And from a distance, it looks sort of orangey. But somebody, selected this from a seedling population, and I will warn you, they do reseed pretty generously around your landscape, and found this one that is pure orange called Tangerine Beauty. You can also find darker red forms. Jekyll, I think, is the dark red form that we have out here in our vine demonstration. But I like the Tangerine Beauty best, and that is the one I often run across in the trade. Not terribly difficult to find in the trade. I see it at garden centers. But you may have to order it online, which I encourage everybody to do. Don't settle for what the garden centers have. If you want a specific plant, get online and find it. There's a great vine nursery down in Georgia called Brushwood. Brushwood has all sorts of great vines, including specific cultivars of our native honeysuckles and such. So you might want to check that out if you cannot find this locally. Now, another thing I love about crossvine, one thing I love the leaves. When you find it out in the wild, you'll see it. It's very easy to recognize on the trunk of a tree. It's kind of easy to confuse the hairy vines of Virginia creeper or poison ivy. But crossvine is going to be snaking up a tree, and on the side of every of the vine at regular intervals, you're going to see little stems coming out, and each little stem has 2 petals. So you'll see 4s, 4s, 4s marching up the tree, and that tells you it's a crossvine. And you could dig that up, bring it home, and plant it out where it gets more sun. It's going to bloom for you. This is the winter color. I mean, I don't think that shows you. It looks brown and dead here, but the truth is it's aubergine, which is an exotic name for eggplant colored. It's a plush sort of purple. And I love the winter color. So I think that's another reason to value it. It stays evergreen. Although this time of year, remember, let me go ahead and say this, so I'm getting a lot of calls. My magnolia's sick. My sweet bay looks terrible that I bought from y'all last year at the plant sale. Well, evergreen plants do lose leaves this time of year. They are dropping their old leaves, and as those leaves age and are about ready to fall, they become necrotic and they start looking diseased and yellow, and they're about to fall off the tree. And the new foliage is going to come on. If it looks bad, call your agent. But I promise you, it's 9 times out of 10, especially with these magnolias, going to look great because it's just a natural process. And that's going to happen with crossvine too. All right, now here we go. Now we're going to get into plants. So some good, I'm going to call these the mainstays, right? The screen planting is divided up into mainstay plants. Let's look for these for our big evergreens. They're going to be the backdrop and are going to do most of the screening work. And then we're going to have a second part we're going to call the accompanying, the complementary plants that we can mix in for texture and color and wildlife, and that are going to complement and going to make it all pretty and wonderful and help us avoid that plant death hole, because we can always amend and not look like we're disturbing the overall design. And then we're going to call the other one the underskirts. And those are going to be lower shrubs that we can just layer under there. Okay, sometimes plants start to get thin underneath as they shade out their own foliage. Pyramidal plants aren't so bad about it because sunlight can strike all the way down to the bottom. But plants that have more of an upright tree canopy, and I'll see this happen sometimes, can actually begin to shade out their own lower foliage. So we have to be careful and understory those sometimes with some of these lower growing evergreens that'll tolerate some of the shade. So that's what the skirt plants are. Rely heavily on some of our junipers. Both our native eastern red cedars and our Chinese junipers do very well for us in this area. And we'll find them in different shades of green and blue-green. We got green point, we got blue point, and use those as your backdrops and your mainstays, but meander them more than this. Don't plant them in a straight line like that. A juniper I'm crazy about, but not everybody loves these Dr. Seuss weirdos. This is Hollywood juniper, and I just think they're each an own work of sculpture. I'm crazy about them. They fell out of vogue for a while, now they're back. In fact, I bought mine over there in the Nashville area, and now they're starting to carry them here locally again as well. Put them where you can enjoy those silhouettes too, because I enjoy that a lot. Tailored juniper, where you need a skinny one. You want that look of an Italian cypress, which is not hardy in Tennessee, no matter what the tag says. Even over here in Memphis, it is not. Look for Taylor because you'll get that effect. This is in Missouri Botanical Garden. And Taylor, boy, if you find them, snatch them up because they go quickly in the tray, because we love to have that strong vertical effect going on. And there's your Italian cypress. You can see the similarity. Other tall narrow plants, there's a whole lot of arborvitae. DeGroot spire, spiralis, thin man. We have a huge collection of them over here at the station. And on your list, you're going to find that on your handout. So be sure you look at those thin if you want those narrow plants. The DeGroot spire will either stay very narrow if you keep removing the offshoots, or if you want to let it become kind of what I call a castle with all these turrets, which I kind of like. Don't worry about that. It'll become very multi-stemmed with a lot of interesting forms and shapes. So whichever is, for your design goals, you can do that either way. This is spiralis. This one, see the spiral? This is right here out back in our parking lot. And these get, 20 feet tall. They're probably 15, 18 in there right now. Little ones that will stay a little bit smaller and are shade tolerant. Sky pencil holly is a Japanese holly. And frankly, I just don't trust Japanese hollies for not succumbing to some kind of root problems. I see them as one of the most problematic in West Tennessee landscapes. So if you do use sky pencil, I see them do great in pots sometimes for a formal effect. And that could be used in your smaller garden, or make sure they are planted very high so that they have good drainage. So make a little heap, plant them on top of the heap, pull the mulch up around the roots. Arizona cypress might be iffy for you because over here, they're perfectly hardy here, and y'all could probably tell me whether or not blue sapphire skies, but we love that blue foliage. It's great for winter cuts, and it grows fairly rapidly for a conifer. They tend to kind of lean and want to pull themselves out of the ground. There's gold forms out there, by the way, as well. But I don't consider them very long-lived. I'll see them planted as screens around Jackson that look good for 20 years, and all of a sudden a couple of said, that's it, that's my lifespan. So use them sparingly. They're one of the ones that I would not consider really a mainstay. Here's a pine that I would consider a mainstay, and that is our Virginia pine. Virginia pines want to be bushy and pyramidal naturally. That's why they're often used actually as Christmas trees. They'll shear them, of course, to be a little bit more compact and perfect pyramids. But our Virginia pine will take dry, rocky sites, stays more shrubby. It's not going to break and fall over on your power lines because it takes forever to get that tall and big. So that one I consider in the right situations where it gets good drainage. This is the mainstay screening plant around the Mile and Arsenal, about 20 minutes from my house and where I took this picture, and they've got many, many of them. The big hollies, my favorite is luster leaf, which is probably borderline for you, although the hybrids won't be. Mary Nail and the red hollies, there's a bunch of those. Here's why I love luster leaf, that great big dark green leaf, which is true of most of the hybrids. You'll know one by the dark foliage and the numerous points on the leaves. You go, you've got luster leaf blood in you. And these hybrids are usually crossed with a very hardy one, Ilex cornuta, and they are going to be more hardy than straight luster leaf. But that's a luster leaf, and that almost looks like a magnolia, does it not? And we can grow them fine over here. There's another shot of ours here at the station and the beautiful red clusters. Now, luster leaf has a famous baby, a hybrid between Ilex latifolia and Ilex cornuta, which is called Mary Nail. And the reason we love Mary Nail is most hollies have to have a male and a female to make the red berries. But Mary Nail makes enough male flowers that she does not need any males planted with her. She's going to take care of herself, thank you. And so if you want all hollies with red berries, then you can have them if you plant that Mary Nail. Makes a fabulous big pyramid. Here they are again in Memphis, but that one would be hardy for you as well. Any of the red hollies, they've come out with several hybrids. Sorry, I'm gonna have to decline this call. And oak leaf is one you're gonna run across, red robin, there's a bunch of them. And again, on your list, check that out. Of the magnolias, my favorite for use in screen plantings is one of the so-called dwarfs. Now, when we say dwarf, it means it's going to be smaller and more compact than straight species magnolia. But little Jim can still get quite large over time, and we're talking 20, 25 feet tall, and maybe 2/3 that width. But the reason I love a little Jim is it keeps on blooming, blooms and blooms and blooms. Interesting thing about little Jim, here it is in our station, blooming throughout the summer months. The interesting about little Jim, it will also take some shade. It will be thinner, however. I'll have to call you back. Sorry, y'all. I couldn't cut it off because I set an alarm for myself, which is gone off and I need to stop. Understory plants, a Cuba if you're in the shade. I've seen a Cuba in Gatlinburg, so I feel like it's going to be hardy for y'all. And it's a fabulous dense evergreen, and the solid green forms I love, as well as the variegated forms. And we can grow hardy palms. We can grow palms here in West Tennessee, Chinese windmill palm and needle palm. Some of those forms are rated hardy to zone 6. So if you want to get a little bit exotic, you might want to look for some of those. And then we also have a list, and I'm going to stop here in just a minute so y'all can ask questions, I promise, that discourages people. Like this is a old pass-along plant that back in the settler days, you grew this hardy citrus in your herb garden because you couldn't run out and buy a lemon or an orange. And this gave you the citrus flavor. It's a thorny plant. It makes this tart little hardy orange. As Don Shatta famously said, if you want to make orangeade with this plant, use 1 barrel of sugar, 1 barrel of water, and 1 of these oranges. It's not quite that tart, but the settlers used it as their lemon or their orange when they were cooking. And it has, you know, there are some places in the South where you will find it has reseeded, and so it gets a bad rap on the invasive plant list. But I love this plant, and it is wicked. And it's actually very much in favor right now for planting for homeland security, because look at those thorns, especially the one called flying dragon, because of the vicious twisting thorns are going to just grab somebody and they're going to hold them. So I use them out at my front gate with my mean plants, because I don't telling people, don't come in here. I don't want you. You're going to get hurt. You're not going to go through my mean planting without getting bloody. And just a few more. Remember, added some flowering things. There are winter flowering plants too. Y'all can grow some of the hardy camellias. This is actually an old Camellia sasanqua that has been quite hardy throughout West Tennessee. I can't promise you I've seen Yuletide on the Cumberland Plateau, but we have had Yuletide forever over here without it getting killed back. And you see it's an open red bloom, very tolerant of even sun or shade. But look up cold hardy camellias. There are camellias that are hardy to 10 below zero. Now, will the flowers hold up to a real cold snap? No, you might lose the flowers sometimes, but other times you're going to get to enjoy them for a few weeks. You're going to find fall blooming series and spring blooming series, and those will be great to add to that screen planting as your complementary role. Not very fast growing, so not one of your mainstays. Oh, and here's the link to the hardy camellias. There's all kind of colors and shapes and forms. Oh, Prague viburnum I have to mention as a mainstay. Here it is in flower, but it's a great big evergreen viburnum that's going to grow almost anywhere, sun or shade, fast growing, and one of my favorites for creating this very informal effect as a backdrop. There's little Jim in the shade. See how it doesn't have any sunlight on it there? That's the north side of the building. And it's a different plant there, isn't it? It's become more pyramidal and layered in the deep shade, whereas out in the full sun, it was more of a, there it is again in shade, more of a dense pyramid. All right, I'm going to stop there so we have time for questions, because I know I'm going to go too long, and that is my worst habit as a speaker. So unmute yourself or chat, or somebody read it from the chat, and I'll try to address your questions.
Yes, right. Carol, this is Linda Glenn, and some of the questions were, I think, directed more to our own extension office, but one of the questions someone asked was, they're really interested in screen plants for the shade. You did cover that during your time speaking. If you have any other ideas that you can pass along.
Yes, I do cover that in the publication. You'll see that in the comments where we put the ones that were shade tolerant. One of my favorites is anise tree, Alyssium parviflorum. So you will see that one in there, and be sure you get that species, because sometimes I see other species in the trade that are not as tough and cold hardy. And that one is going to be more durable for you. And don't be discouraged when you see it in the pot, okay? It looks terrible in a pot. It's lanky and skanky, and it looks very irregular and ugly. Put it out in the grounds, and I probably have it coming up here in the slideshow. Come on. Ah, there we are. This is what it looks like in sun. It'll do sun or shade. It's olivey green, and that's what it looks like in shade. And that is not pruned. It's going to get that. It's going to get there naturally if you'll just leave it alone. It just wants to have time to fill out. And I saw them at Lowe's, which I don't like for you to go shop at the big box stores, but they're at Lowe's right now, laying over, needing watering, and need somebody to rescue them. And they look terrible. Nobody's going to buy them. And yet if you took them home, put them in sun or shade, and take care of them, they're tolerant of a wide range of conditions. This is eventually what you're going to get. That's okay.
So I would encourage everyone to go to that publication Carol talked about earlier.
Alex vomitoria is shade tolerant. Y'all are too cold for southern wax myrtle, although Hiwassee came from East Tennessee as a hardier form. And there's another one I've really gotten. Agarista, if you can find it, it's a little bit harder to find. But there are several in there that are marked for shade. And there's not many. There's about 5 that really are deep shade tolerant. Camellias would be one.
Yeah, so again, I put in the chat box regarding that UT Hort. That's pretty easy to remember. If you just use any search engine, UT Horticulture or UT Hort website, and just follow those icons. We've got the screen plantings publication in there. and it serves as a good topic. Carol, one thing that someone asked about recommendations regarding designs and helping with designs, and I'll ask you to address that. And I'll first tell you kind of my thoughts, and then I'll ask for your thoughts on these. Is from just because someone has a sign on their truck door that they're a landscaping business doesn't really necessarily mean that they know much about the landscape business.
Yeah, we call them land scrapers.
So, well, that's what Lucas calls them, land scrapers, for sure. So the thing that I would tell you to do is just like plant selections, just like doing your homework on your landscaping or landscape design, do your homework and ask for references, check out what they've done. But in addition to that, you know, if I approach someone from a landscape design standpoint, I would kind of want to already have an idea of plants and things that I might want to utilize. I think it's anymore through our used to, we didn't have these, or if we had them, they really were hard to find in terms of the landscape publications. But we're getting a lot of good information out there that kind of gives people an idea of those plants and plant pairings and things that you could.
Well, honestly, Greg, you could hand the publication to so if you want somebody to install it for you and say, I want this, because we have a really good drawing on there on how to, you know, there's a whole big section on the design on that publication. And I apologize, I must have put that slide into another program I had open, because I had opened about 3 and I was stealing slides out of them. But it on there, it talks about how many design tips you have on that. And I have given this same list over and over and over now to so a lot of the new solar farms that are going in over here. They're required to plant screen plants so that the neighboring people that live there don't have to look at a solar farm. So I have given this to many landscapers now across West Tennessee, and they know which plants are going to do well, which ones to use in the wetter areas, because that also is in the comments. So when you have a straight line like this, I mean, look, we've got a downhill, right? You got plants are going to do better on the up and the well-drained and the drier soils. And we got, as we go down there and we got a wet pocket, we got to change plants. And we're going to meander it and make it fill in quickly, because people don't want to look at polka dot plants for 10 years while they're waiting on this screen. You know, they hate the solar farms going in next door, though they want the solar energy. So use that. I mean, that design tip thing, part of that thing, and I apologize again, I had that slide on here that would link you to it, and I put it into another program. And if you wanted to, print it out and hand it to them and talk to them. And also remember that you are the person in charge. If you want to get out there, and I kind of a little bit feel like, surely I showed you enough on design that you can go out there and make a meandering woodland perimeter or a meandering edge, and then think about the plants that would be appropriate in there and put your stakes in there with the right names on there. And then find a landscaper to find them and install them as per your instructions. Because I might not trust a landscaper on design, but I might trust him to do the actual physical labor that I'm unable to do anymore. And I would also be sure I watched him plant them, because even some of those landscapers don't plant properly. They bury too deep. You know, they don't know about changing they mulch too high, you know, they put the volcano. So get out there and be the design coach, you know, take charge of that planting.